For many dogs, the door is never just a door. Long before it becomes background, it carries weight. It represents arrival and departure, safety and uncertainty, connection and loss. Some dogs learn early that the door is where people disappear and sometimes return, and for those dogs, watching it becomes a way of staying anchored to what matters most. They lie near it, position their bodies toward it, track every sound that passes through it, as though attention alone might prevent something important from slipping away. So when a dog stops watching the door, it is rarely sudden and never meaningless. It doesn't happen because the door has lost importance, but because something else has gained it. The change arrives quietly, often without notice, until one day you realize the dog is no longer waiting in the way they once did, and the space near the door feels different than it used to. Why the door becomes a focus. Dogs are relational animals whose sense of safety is built around patterns and people. When those patterns feel unstable, vigilance fills the gap. Watching the door becomes a form of emotional orientation, a way of staying connected to the possibility of return or preparing for another absence. This is especially true for dogs who have experienced rehoming, separation, or inconsistency, where the door once marked moments that changed everything. For these dogs, the door holds memory more than function. It is where endings happened, where beginnings were uncertain, and where waiting felt necessary. The body remembers this even when the mind no longer actively does, and so the behavior persists not out of habit, but out of self-protection. The slow shift from waiting to settling. The shift away from the door does not happen all at once. At first, the dog still watches, but their attention softens. Their body no longer stays tightly coiled. They glance rather than stare. Over time, they choose to lie slightly farther away, still aware, but no longer centered on the exit. Eventually, without announcement, they select a different place entirely, one that offers comfort rather than readiness. This change is not resignation, and it is not forgetting. It is resolution. The dog's nervous system begins to accept that nothing essential will be lost if they stop monitoring the threshold. What once required vigilance now feels predictable enough to allow rest. When vigilance releases from the body. A dog who watches the door carries tension even in stillness. Their ears remain tuned to sound, their muscles ready to rise, their breathing shallow enough to wake quickly. When that vigilance fades, the body tells the story before behavior ever does. Breathing deepens, limbs stretch instead of tuck. Sleep grows heavier and less easily disturbed. This is not a trained response or learned behavior. It is a physiological shift that occurs when the dog no longer feels responsible for preventing separation. The world no longer feels fragile enough to require constant attention, and the body responds by letting go. Turning away from the door. One of the most meaningful moments comes when a dog physically turns their body away from the door. Orientation matters deeply to dogs, and where they face reveals what they consider important. When the door stops being the focal point, something else has taken its place. Often, that something is you. The dog begins to rest where they can sense your presence rather than track the exit. They watch your movement through the home instead of the hallway. They sleep through departures they once followed closely. This does not mean they no longer care about who leaves or arrives. It means they trust that connection does not disappear just because someone steps outside. The role of consistency. This transition only happens when consistency has quietly accumulated over time. Meals arrive as expected. Voices remain familiar. Departures are followed by returns often enough that the pattern becomes reliable. The dog does not consciously count these moments, but their body keeps score. Each ordinary day without disruption adds another layer of certainty, until eventually the need to watch fades because the outcome feels known. Trust, for dogs, is not built through reassurance, but through repetition. When the world behaves the same way often enough, vigilance becomes unnecessary. Forgetting versus settling. People sometimes worry that when a dog stops watching the door, it means they have forgotten someone they once waited for. But dogs do not forget through absence. They settle through presence. Memory does not vanish when behavior changes. It simply stops dominating the present moment. The door loses importance when the dog learns that love does not vanish with movement, that connection is not dependent on constant observation, and that safety is not something they have to protect alone. This is not loss. It is healing expressed through calm. What this moment asks of us. When a dog reaches this stage, they are offering trust without conditions. They are allowing themselves to rest without monitoring the world for change. This is not a moment to disrupt routines or test independence. It is a moment that asks for quiet reliability in return. Calm presence, predictable rhythms, and gentle consistency reinforce the belief the dog has finally formed, that the world they are resting in will remain stable. What they need most now is not attention, but continuity. If your dog has stopped watching the door, it can be helpful to pause and gently notice what has taken its place. Notice where they choose to rest now, not just physically, but emotionally. Notice whether their body seems heavier against the floor, whether their breathing slows sooner, whether sleep arrives without effort. These small changes often say more than behavior ever could, because they reveal how safe the dog feels when nothing is being asked of them. Dogs do not stop waiting because they lose hope or forget what mattered before. Waiting fades when vigilance is no longer required, when the world around them begins to feel steady enough that attention can finally soften. The door stops holding meaning not because it failed them, but because something more reliable replaced it. Presence becomes stronger than anticipation, and certainty begins to outweigh fear. When a dog chooses rest over readiness, they are telling you that the story they are living in has changed. Not temporarily, not cautiously, but in a way that feels stable enough to trust. In that quiet decision to lie down facing away from the exit, to sleep through sounds they once followed, to anchor themselves to the space instead of the threshold, the dog is expressing something deeply personal. When your dog has stopped watching the door, notice what has replaced that behavior. Notice where they choose to lie, how deeply they sleep, and what they orient themselves toward now. Dogs do not stop waiting because they give up hope. They stop waiting because something they needed has finally arrived. When a dog chooses rest over vigilance, they are telling you that the story has changed, not just for today, but in a way that feels lasting. They believe they are home. At Dog Facts Funny, we believe some of the most meaningful moments with animals unfold quietly, without celebration or instruction. When a dog stops watching the door, it may look like nothing has changed, but in truth, everything has. If this episode helped you understand your dog, or a dog you once knew, a little more deeply, you're welcome here. Consider subscribing if you'd like to continue exploring the silent language animals use when they finally feel safe enough to stop waiting. Until next time, notice where they rest. That choice carries a story.